Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the strangest family dramas in all of history. A story filled with crowns, castles, royal weddings and jawlines so dramatic they could probably cut glass. We're talking about the Habsburgs, the royal dynasty that spent centuries marrying their cousins, their uncles, their nieces, and occasionally someone who was probably all three at once on the same family tree. Now before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these strange little journeys through history. And if you were one of the people who suggested this topic, thank you for the idea. Your suggestions help shape these stories more than you might realise. And while you're there, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow, someone out there is always listening to these stories at 2:17 AM. Quietly wondering why medieval kings thought marrying their second cousin was a perfectly reasonable dating strategy. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, settle into your blanket and try to get comfortable. Let's get curious for a second. Have you ever wondered what happens when the most powerful families in Europe decide that the best way to keep power is to marry themselves? What would it feel like to grow up in a palace where your family tree looks less like a tree and more like a tangled knot? Could you survive a royal childhood where half your relatives are also technically your cousins, great uncles, and in some cases both? What happens when generations of kings and queens all insist that the bloodline must stay pure, even if the results start looking a little unusual? Would you still feel like royalty if your jaw was so large you struggled to chew your dinner? Would you enjoy ruling Europe if half your court whispered that the royal family might be slowly turning into a medical mystery? And perhaps most importantly, how did an entire dynasty manage to rule half the world while simultaneously creating some of the most famously bizarre faces in human history? Well, tonight you're about to find out. Because congratulations, you've just woken up in a Habsburg palace in the early 1500s. Your parents are related, your grandparents are related, your great-grandparents were also related, and unfortunately for you, the family wedding invitations are about to get very awkward. So let's begin. You wake up inside a palace that doesn't belong to just one kingdom. It belongs to many. Spain, Austria, parts of Italy, the Netherlands and half of Europe seem to answer to your family name, Habsburg. The dynasty's motto might as well be simple and efficient. Let other people fight wars, we'll just marry their daughters instead. Through strategic marriages, the Habsburgs quietly stitched together one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. Unfortunately, they also stitched together something else. An extremely tangled family tree. You sit up in your enormous bed, wrapped in velvet blankets that probably cost more than an average village earns in a decade. Somewhere outside your window, church bells are ringing across a city that technically belongs to you, or at least to your relatives, which in the Habsburg world is basically the same thing. Because here's the trick. The Habsburg dynasty doesn't conquer Europe the way most empires do. They don't march endless armies across muddy fields every year. They don't constantly storm castles or burn cities to the ground. No, the Habsburgs discovered something far more efficient: marriage. In fact, the family slogan might as well be the famous line historians love to quote: "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." Which sounds romantic until you realise this strategy turns Europe into the world's most complicated wedding reception. Imagine it for a moment. A princess from Spain marries an Austrian archduke. Their son marries a cousin from another branch of the family. That cousin's sister marries into the Netherlands. Suddenly, entire countries start showing up on the Habsburg family tree like surprise guests who never leave. Before long, you're not just ruling one kingdom, you're ruling several. Spain, that's yours. Austria, also yours. Large parts of Italy. Why not? The Low Countries. Sure, throw those in too. It's like inheriting half the continent through a series of extremely awkward family dinners. And the best part, no battlefield required. While other royal families are exhausting themselves in endless wars, the Habsburgs are busy arranging weddings, signing marriage contracts, and sending polite letters that basically say, "Congratulations, we're related now, so we own your kingdom." Of course, there is one small side effect to this strategy. When you keep marrying within the same royal circles again and again, the number of available relatives begins to shrink. At first, it's not a big deal. Royal families all across Europe are somewhat related anyway. Cousin marriages are common. Nobody really blinks an eye. But with the Habsburgs, the pattern becomes enthusiastic. A cousin here, another cousin there, an uncle-niece marriage every once in a while. Nothing too unusual for the era, at least at first glance. Except generation after generation keeps repeating the pattern, and slowly, quietly, the family tree starts doing something unusual. Instead of branching outward like a healthy oak tree, it begins curling back on itself like a very confused pretzel. If you could see the Habsburg genealogy chart spread across a table, it would look less like a tree and more like someone accidentally tied a knot in it. The same names appear again and again, the same ancestors repeat, grandparents show up twice, sometimes 3 times. At royal weddings, half the guests are already related before the ceremony even starts, which means that, while the Habsburgs are successfully collecting kingdoms like shiny trophies, they're also doing something else without realizing it. They're slowly turning their dynasty into Europe's most exclusive family club. Membership requirements, noble blood, a royal title, and preferably being someone's cousin. And this strategy, brilliant as it seems in the moment, is going to shape the fate of the entire dynasty for centuries. But for now, as you step into the candlelit halls of your palace and servants bow politely as you pass, everything looks like success. Your family rules half of Europe. Your dynasty seems unstoppable. Your relatives sit on more thrones than anyone can comfortably count. What could possibly go wrong with a family plan built almost entirely around marrying each other? Well, you're about to find out. Let's talk about dating in the Habsburg family. Most royal houses tried to form alliances through marriage. The Habsburgs took this concept and turned it into a lifestyle. Instead of constantly marrying into new families, they often looked at their own relatives and thought, close enough. Cousin marriages became routine. Uncles married nieces. Dynastic power stayed neatly inside the same genetic circle. Politically, it was brilliant. Biologically, it was less ideal. Now imagine you're a royal advisor in the Habsburg court. Your job is not to plan battles or train soldiers. Your job is to arrange weddings. Endless weddings. Somewhere in a candlelit chamber, surrounded by maps and family charts that look increasingly like a bowl of tangled noodles, you and a group of very serious-looking diplomats are discussing the future of Europe. Not through war, through engagement announcements. You point to Spain. Someone else points to Austria. Another advisor waves a scroll and announces that a certain archduke happens to have a daughter who is technically available and only mildly related to the young prince you're discussing. Everyone nods, thoughtfully. Yes, perfect. Another excellent match. Because from the Habsburg perspective, the goal is simple. Keep power inside the family. If your daughter marries into another royal dynasty, that's nice, but it means another family gains influence. Their children might inherit something that used to belong to you. But if your daughter marries her cousin, well, that's practically a corporate merger. The kingdoms stay in the same hands. The titles remain safely within the dynasty. The land doesn't wander off into the hands of strangers with suspiciously different last names. It's the royal equivalent of saying, let's keep this business in the family. And at first, it works beautifully. Over the 1500s and 1600s, the Habsburgs become the ultimate collectors of crowns. Spain, Austria, Hungary, parts of Italy. The Low Countries, one by one, territories drift into their orbit like iron filings around a magnet, all thanks to carefully arranged marriages, which, if you're a young Habsburg prince or princess, means your romantic life is about as spontaneous as a tax audit. You're not meeting someone at a dance and falling deeply in love. You're being introduced to a relative during a diplomatic dinner, while several ambassadors quietly calculate the geopolitical consequences of your future children. Someone clears their throat. "This is your cousin." Another voice adds, very optimistically, "a distant cousin." And just like that, the court begins planning the wedding. To be fair, cousin marriage was not unusual among European royalty. Dynasties everywhere did it occasionally. The goal was always the same: preserve alliances, wealth, and influence. But the Habsburgs approached the idea with remarkable enthusiasm. Generation after generation continued the pattern. Cousin marriages became normal. Uncle-niece marriages appeared more frequently. The circle slowly tightened. And because the dynasty was so powerful, fewer and fewer families were considered suitable matches anyway. Royal blood had to remain pure, which meant the list of acceptable spouses was already very short. Conveniently, most of those acceptable spouses happened to already be sitting at the same dinner table. Now, at this point in history, nobody understands genetics. The science simply doesn't exist yet. There are no charts explaining recessive traits or inherited conditions. From the perspective of the Habsburg court, the strategy makes perfect sense. Keep the empire together, keep the bloodline strong, keep the crowns within the same dynasty. Simple, efficient, brilliant even. Except there is a small problem quietly developing in the background. Every time the family tree loops back on itself, certain traits become more likely to appear. At first, the changes are subtle. A slightly familiar facial structure here, a similar chin there, nothing too alarming. But as the generations pass, the family resemblance becomes unmistakable. Portrait. Painters start noticing it. Court physicians begin whispering about unusual health problems, and historians, centuries later, will look back at the Habsburg marriage strategy and describe it as one of the most ambitious dynastic plans ever attempted. A plan that successfully united half of Europe and accidentally created one of the most famous family resemblances in human history. But for now, in your candlelit palace surrounded by advisors happily planning yet another royal wedding, everything still feels like a brilliant idea. After all, what could possibly go wrong with marrying your cousin? Again, and again, and again. Your story really begins with Emperor Maximilian I, a man who realized something clever. Wars were expensive, but weddings were cheaper. Instead of conquering territories with armies, Maximilian preferred conquering them with marriage contracts. His famous strategy reshaped Europe through carefully arranged unions. But while he was building an empire through matrimony, he was also setting the stage for centuries of increasingly complicated family relationships. Picture yourself standing in Maximilian's court sometime in the late 1400s. The room smells faintly of candle wax, parchment, and the slow burning anxiety of European politics. Maps of the continent lie spread across heavy wooden tables, and every map looks less like geography and more like an opportunity. Maximilian isn't staring at battle plans, he's staring at family trees. Because while most rulers of the era are busy sharpening swords and marching armies across muddy fields, Maximilian has discovered something much more efficient. Marriage. Armies are expensive. Soldiers need food, weapons, horses, and occasionally pay. Wars drag on for years, sometimes decades. And even if you win, you still have to deal with rebellious provinces and angry neighbours. But a wedding? A wedding's polite. A wedding's diplomatic. A wedding comes with cake, music, and a legally binding contract that might quietly transfer half a kingdom into your dynasty. It's conquest with better table settings, and Maximilian, to his credit, is very good at it. In 1477 he marries Mary of Burgundy, one of the wealthiest heiresses in Europe. This single marriage suddenly brings enormous territories into Habsburg influence, including the prosperous Low Countries. Cities like Brussels, Antwerp and Ghent, rich trade hubs buzzing with merchants and ships, now fall under the growing Habsburg orbit. All because of one well-arranged wedding. You can almost imagine Maximilian sitting back afterward, looking at the map of Europe and thinking, well, that worked. Naturally, he decides to keep going. Instead of relying on war to expand the dynasty, he begins arranging marriages for his children with the precision of someone playing a very serious game of international chess. His son Philip marries Joanna of Castile, the daughter of the powerful Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. Suddenly Spain, one of the rising superpowers of Europe, becomes connected to the Habsburg family, not through invasion, through in-laws, and just like that, the Habsburg dynasty gains a foothold in a kingdom that stretches across the Iberian Peninsula and is about to build a massive overseas empire in the Americas, which means Maximilian's marriage strategy isn't just affecting Europe, it's about to affect the entire world. At court, scribes copy marriage contracts, ambassadors travel between kingdoms carrying proposals, and nervous young princes and princesses practice polite conversation with relatives they may soon be expected to marry. If you're a member of the Habsburg family, romance is not really the point. Geography is. Your future spouse is selected less for personality and more for which territories happen to come attached. And slowly, quietly, the plan works. By the early 1500s, the Habsburgs control a staggering collection of lands. Their relatives sit on thrones across multiple regions. Their influence stretches from the Alps to Spain and far beyond. All because one emperor realized something simple. Why spend decades fighting wars when you can just send a wedding invitation? Of course, there is a small complication to building an empire through family ties. The more territories the dynasty acquires through marriage, the more important it becomes to keep those territories inside the same family, which means the pool of acceptable marriage partners slowly starts shrinking. And if you keep the circle small enough for long enough, eventually you start running out of new relatives. But that is a problem for future generations. For now, Maximilian's strategy looks like pure genius. The empire is expanding, the dynasty is thriving, and Europe is slowly being reorganized one wedding at a time. Soon, cousin marriage wasn't just common in the Habsburg dynasty. It became the default setting. Royal courts across Europe had complicated family ties, but the Habsburgs took it to a new level. Generation after generation married within the same shrinking circle of relatives. If you look at their family tree today, historians sometimes joke that it resembles less of a tree and more of a ladder. Imagine yourself sitting in a quiet palace study, staring at a massive parchment chart spread across the table. Names branch outward in elegant ink, tiny crowns drawn beside each one. At first glance, it looks like an impressive dynasty. Then you notice something strange. The branches keep reconnecting. A cousin here marries another cousin there. A niece marries an uncle. A princess from one branch of the family marries a prince from another branch who also happens to share several of the same grandparents. If you follow the lines long enough, the chart begins to loop back on itself like a medieval maze designed by someone who really liked keeping things in the family, and from the Habsburg perspective, this isn't strange at all. In fact, it's the plan. The logic seems perfectly reasonable if you're a royal strategist in the 1500s. Your empire now stretches across multiple kingdoms, and every marriage carries enormous political weight. Marry your daughter to a rival dynasty and suddenly that family gains influence over your lands. Their children might inherit territories you spent generations collecting. But marry inside the family. Problem solved. The crowns stay where they belong. The land stays in Habsburg hands, and every new generation reinforces the dynasty's grip on Europe. Think of it like a very powerful family business, except instead of arguing over who runs the bakery, you're arguing over who inherits Spain. So royal matchmakers begin narrowing their search. When a prince reaches marriage age, advisors start scanning the list of available candidates. They look at nearby dynasties, evaluate alliances, weigh political advantages, and then inevitably glance back at the family tree. And there they are. Several perfectly acceptable cousins. They're already noble. They already share the correct bloodline. Their marriage won't hand power to some suspicious foreign dynasty with questionable loyalty. Honestly, it's just easier. Before long, cousin marriages become routine. No one gasps, no one raises eyebrows. Royal courts across Europe are already tangled with family ties anyway. But the Habsburgs take the habit further than most. Generation after generation continues the pattern. The circle grows smaller, and the family resemblance grows stronger. Now, at this point in history, no one understands genetics. The word itself won't exist for centuries. There are no charts explaining recessive traits or inherited conditions. What people do notice, however, are similarities. Royal portraits begin to show familiar features appearing again and again. A certain shape of the jaw, a certain look in the face. Courtiers sometimes whisper that the Habsburg family can be recognized from across a crowded hall. Even court painters quietly adapt. When they paint a Habsburg ruler, they angle the head slightly, soften the shadows, and maybe adjust the lighting so certain features look more regal and less memorable. After all, their job isn't to create a medical diagram. Their job is to make the emperor look magnificent. But the resemblance keeps returning. Every new wedding inside the dynasty strengthens the same pool of inherited traits. The family tree tightens a little more, like a knot being pulled slowly but steadily. And yet no one stops. Because politically, the strategy still works. The Habsburgs continue ruling enormous territories. Their relatives occupy thrones across Europe. Their dynasty seems stronger than ever. From the palace windows, the empire looks stable and glorious. But if you step back and examine that strange family chart on the table again, the one with all the looping lines and repeating names, you might begin to notice something unsettling. The ladder is getting narrower, and everyone climbing it is related. Somewhere along the line, people started noticing something unusual about the family portraits. The chins, the jaws, the faces that looked like they were permanently leaning forward into history. This distinctive facial structure, now known as the Habsburg jaw, began appearing again and again across generations. It became so recognizable that you could often identify a Habsburg ruler just by looking at their profile. Now imagine yourself standing in a quiet royal gallery. The air smells faintly of varnish and candle smoke. Portraits line the walls from floor to ceiling, each framed in heavy gold and staring down at you with the calm confidence of people who owned entire countries. At first glance, the paintings look perfectly normal. Kings in armour, queens in elaborate gowns, noble poses, regal expressions. But the longer you stare, the more something begins to stand out. The chins, not just one chin, all the chins. In portrait after portrait, the same distinctive feature appears. A lower jaw that pushes forward slightly, as if the face itself is leaning into the future before the rest of the body arrives. The lips sit a little apart. The jawline stretches outward just enough to make artists reach for very strategic lighting. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. This is what historians now call the Habsburg jaw, or more formally, mandibular prognathism. It's a genetic trait that causes the lower jaw to protrude noticeably beyond the upper jaw. In modern medicine, it's well understood. In the 1500s and 1600s, however, it was simply the family look, and in royal courts the look of a ruler mattered. Portraits were not casual selfies, they were political statements. When a new king took the throne, his portrait would travel across Europe. Other courts, foreign ambassadors, and potential marriage partners would see it. These paintings were meant to project strength, beauty, and divine authority. So the painters had a delicate task. On one hand, they needed to capture the ruler's likeness accurately enough that people recognized him. On the other hand, they also needed to avoid making the emperor look like he could open a walnut with his teeth. Artists became masters of subtle adjustments. Heads were tilted slightly upward, shadows softened the jawline. Beards appeared more frequently in certain periods, sometimes helping disguise the shape of the chin. It was less deception and more creative diplomacy with a paintbrush. But the resemblance remained unmistakable. By the time several generations had passed, courtiers and diplomats could recognize a Habsburg almost instantly. If a stranger walked into the palace with that familiar forward jaw and the unmistakable family features, someone nearby would whisper quietly, "Ah, one of them." The trait didn't just appear in paintings either, it sometimes affected speech and chewing. Some Habsburg rulers reportedly struggled to close their mouths comfortably, and others developed dental problems that made eating difficult. Which means royal dinners were occasionally less glamorous than they looked. Picture the grand banquet hall. Silver plates, roasted meats, goblets of wine, musicians playing softly in the corner, nobles chatting politely while servants glide between tables carrying platters of elaborate food. Meanwhile, the king is trying very carefully to chew a piece of venison without turning the evening meal into a medical challenge. History rarely mentions that part in the official records. And yet, despite the whispers, the portraits, and the increasingly recognizable family resemblance, the dynasty continues exactly as before. The same marriage patterns continue. The same small circle of relatives becomes the pool of royal spouses. And with each new generation, the famous Habsburg jaw quietly becomes more pronounced. At first it's just a recognizable feature. Then it becomes a dynasty trademark, and eventually it becomes a warning sign that something unusual is happening deep inside the royal family tree. But for now, as you leave the portrait gallery, and the painted kings continue staring silently from the walls, one thing is certain. If you ever need to identify a Habsburg ruler in a crowd, just look for the chin arriving a few seconds before the rest of him. You now find yourself under the rule of Charles V, a man who inherited so many territories that he famously said the sun never set on his empire. But ruling half the world comes with stress, politics, and constant wars. Charles V also carried the genetic legacy of centuries of intermarriage, and historians today believe he already showed signs of the physical traits that would later define the dynasty. So, congratulations. You now live in an empire so large that if you started riding a horse west at sunrise, you could still technically be inside Habsburg territory by sunset, assuming your horse didn't quit halfway out of exhaustion. Charles V inherits an astonishing collection of lands: Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and a rapidly expanding overseas empire in the Americas all somehow land on his desk at once. Not literally, of course. Medieval desks would collapse under that much paperwork. But the responsibility is real. You wake each morning in a palace buzzing with messengers. Couriers arrive with letters from distant governors, bishops, generals, and ambassadors. Some bring news of rebellions, others bring complaints. A few simply bring long lists of expenses that make the royal treasurer quietly reach for another glass of wine. Running this empire is like trying to manage 50 different kingdoms at the same time, each with its own language, laws, and group of nobles who all believe they should be in charge. Spain wants one thing. The German princes want another. The Italian states have their own complicated dramas. And somewhere across the ocean, explorers are discovering entirely new continents that now, apparently, also belong to you. Which sounds impressive until you realise it means someone has to govern all of it, that someone is Charles V. Now imagine trying to hold together this massive political puzzle while Europe itself is going through one of the most chaotic periods in its history. The Protestant Reformation is spreading across the German states, challenging the authority of the Catholic Church. Religious tension erupts into arguments, debates, and eventually wars. Charles, a devout Catholic, finds himself constantly negotiating, threatening, and occasionally fighting to keep the empire from fracturing. At the same time, the French King Francis I is eager to challenge Habsburg power whenever possible. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent is expanding westward, threatening the borders of Europe itself. So while you might picture a king lounging, comfortably in velvet robes, the reality is much closer to a permanently exhausted emperor travelling from city to city trying to keep everything from falling apart. Charles spends years on the move. Castles in Spain, palaces in Germany, fortresses in Italy. Wherever trouble appears, Charles eventually shows up, surrounded by advisors and soldiers, trying to restore order. And if you ever wanted a visual reminder that ruling half the world is stressful, just look at the portraits of Charles V. The famous Habsburg features are already visible. The jawline pushes forward slightly, the face long and serious. Artists portray him with the heavy dignity expected of an emperor, but there is also a sense of weight behind the expression. The weight of an empire that may simply be too large for one person to manage. Charles himself eventually realises this. After decades of war, political strain and endless travel, the emperor makes a decision that shocks Europe. He abdicates. Instead of clinging to power until death, Charles divides the empire between his heirs. Spain and its overseas territories go to his son Philip II. The Austrian lands and the imperial title pass to his brother Ferdinand. Then, in one of history's quieter royal exits, Charles retires to a monastery in Spain. Picture it. The man who once ruled territories across multiple continents, now spending his days in relative silence among monks, listening to church bells instead of battlefield reports. After a lifetime of managing the most complicated empire in Europe, perhaps the quiet halls of a monastery finally felt like the most peaceful kingdom of all. Growing up as a Habsburg child was strange. Your parents, grandparents, and cousins were often the same handful of people repeated across multiple branches of the family tree. Court tutors taught you languages, diplomacy, and theology, but nobody talked about genetics. Mostly because the concept didn't exist yet. From their perspective, marrying, family members simply kept the bloodline pure. Your morning begins in a palace room large enough to house several normal families. Sunlight filters through tall windows, touching the tapestries on the walls, scenes of battle, saints and ancestors who all look suspiciously familiar. That's because if you glance at the portraits carefully, you'll notice something unusual. Some of the people on the walls are not just your ancestors, they're also your cousins, sometimes your great-uncles. Occasionally they're both at the same time, which makes explaining the family tree feel a bit like trying to solve a puzzle while half asleep. But to everyone around you, this is perfectly normal. A servant helps you dress in carefully tailored clothing, probably stitched by someone who spent weeks embroidering tiny gold threads into the fabric. Then you're guided into the schoolroom, where your tutors are already waiting. Royal children don't have a relaxed childhood. They have a schedule. You begin with languages, Latin of course. A future ruler must read documents, treaties and church texts. Then perhaps Spanish, German or French, depending on which branch of the Habsburg Empire you're expected to manage someday. After languages comes diplomacy. Your tutors explain how to greet ambassadors, how to recognize noble titles, and how to smile politely even when the person you're speaking with might secretly be plotting against your family. Then theology. Because ruling in this era means ruling with divine approval, or at least appearing to. What you do not study, however, is biology. No one in the 1500s is explaining the risks of repeated cousin marriages. No one is drawing diagrams showing how inherited traits pass through generations. Instead, the idea everyone believes in is much simpler. Bloodlines. Royal blood is considered special, almost sacred. Kings rule by divine right, which means their families must remain noble, pure and untouched, by common ancestry. Marrying within royal circles isn't just tradition, it's practically a duty. And since the Habsburg family already holds enormous power, the easiest way to maintain that power is to keep marriages inside the dynasty, which means when you're a young prince or princess, the list of possible future spouses is surprisingly short. Sometimes you meet them early. Imagine a formal dinner in the palace. Candles flicker along a long table while nobles speak quietly about politics. Across from you sits another young royal relative, a cousin, perhaps a second cousin, possibly a cousin who is also related through two different branches of the family. The adults glance at the two of you and exchange polite smiles. Very promising match. You may not realize it yet, but the entire room is already thinking about your future wedding. This is the environment you grow up in, a world where family, politics, and power are completely intertwined, where cousins become political, allies, and marriages are designed to secure thrones rather than romance. And inside this comfortable royal bubble, everything feels stable. The empire stretches across Europe. Your relatives sit on multiple thrones. The Habsburg name commands enormous respect. From the palace windows, the dynasty looks unstoppable. No one suspects that this carefully protected bloodline, this proud family tradition of marrying within the dynasty, will eventually create problems that no tutor, priest, or royal advisor yet understands. Because for now, as you walk through the palace halls surrounded by portraits of familiar faces and familiar jaws, everything seems perfectly reasonable. After all, what could be safer than keeping power in the family, especially when the family is practically everyone you know? Royal marriage was never about love. It was about heirs. Every king and queen faced enormous pressure to produce healthy sons who could inherit the throne. But with each generation of close marriages, the odds of complications quietly increased. Still, the dynasty pressed forward, convinced their strategy was the key to maintaining power. So now you find yourself standing in the middle of a royal wedding. The cathedral is enormous, echoing with choir music and the quiet murmurs of nobles dressed in enough silk and velvet to bankrupt a small town. Candles flicker against stone walls, and the air smells faintly of incense and nervous ambition. You're not here for romance. You're here for the future of an empire. The bride and groom stand before the altar in carefully arranged finery. They bow their heads as priests recite blessings in Latin. Around them sit ambassadors, generals, bishops, and royal relatives who are all quietly calculating the same thing. Children, preferably sons, lots of them. Because in a royal dynasty, an heir is not just a baby. An heir is stability. An heir prevents wars. An heir reassures nobles that the kingdom won't collapse into chaos the moment the current ruler dies. Without an heir, Europe has a bad habit of exploding into conflict. You've probably noticed that medieval history contains a suspicious number of wars that begin with the phrase, "After the king died without a clear successor." No heir means rival claimants. Rival claimants mean armies. Armies mean battlefields full of men arguing over which cousin technically deserves to wear the crown. So royal couples face enormous pressure from the moment the wedding feast ends. Courtiers whisper, Advisors watch closely, and the royal doctors who, it must be said, are working with medical knowledge that would make a modern nurse quietly faint, begin keeping track of every pregnancy. If a healthy son is born, the entire court celebrates like the kingdom just won the lottery. Bells ring, cannons fire. Poets write very enthusiastic verses about destiny. But if pregnancies fail, or if children are born sickly, the atmosphere in the palace changes quickly, because everyone understands what is at stake. In the Habsburg dynasty, this pressure becomes especially intense. Their empire stretches across multiple kingdoms. Spain alone governs vast territories, including new colonies across the Atlantic. Austria controls lands throughout Central Europe. The Holy Roman Empire adds another complicated layer of political responsibility. All of this power must pass through the next generation, which means every royal child is expected to carry not just the family name, but the stability of an entire continent. And here is where the quiet problem begins to grow. The dynasty's marriage strategy, so effective at keeping power inside the family, also means that many of these royal couples share very close bloodlines. Cousins marry cousins, uncles marry nieces. The family tree loops back on itself again and again. No one in the palace understands the science behind what this might cause. The word genetics won't exist for another 200 years, but people do notice patterns. Some royal children struggle with health problems. Others grow slowly or remain physically fragile. Some suffer from illnesses that doctors cannot explain. Court physicians try their best. They prescribe herbal mixtures, prayers, careful diets, and occasionally extremely questionable medical procedures involving leeches. None of this addresses the real issue. But because the political system depends on heirs, the dynasty keeps following the same strategy. Another cousin marriage, another royal wedding, another generation expected to produce the perfect successor. From the outside, the Habsburg Empire still looks powerful and stable. The crowns remain in the family. The territories stay connected through blood and marriage. Inside the palace, however, the pressure never stops. Every royal cradle carries enormous expectations, and every newborn child is greeted with the same silent question hanging over the entire court. Will this one be strong enough to inherit the empire? Because if the answer is no, the consequences will echo far beyond the nursery walls. Court painters tried their best to flatter royal faces, but even the most talented artists couldn't completely hide certain features. The protruding jawline, elongated faces, and unusual proportions kept appearing. In official portraits, painters softened the details, but modern historians examining those paintings can clearly see the genetic pattern repeating across centuries. Now imagine you are a court painter arriving at the Habsburg palace. This is not a casual job. Painting a king or queen is one of the most important artistic assignments in Europe. Your work will hang in palaces, travel to foreign courts, and represent the ruler to people who may never meet them in person. Which means your painting must accomplish two very delicate tasks. First, it must look like the ruler. Second, it must make the ruler look magnificent. You are led into a grand hall where the monarch sits waiting, patiently, or at least pretending to. Behind them hang velvet curtains, gilded furniture, and symbols of power. Crowns, swords, globes, and banners displaying the enormous reach of the empire. You bow politely, your brushes are ready. And then you notice the jaw. It's not shocking at first, just a little more pronounced than usual, but when you study the ruler's profile, the lower jaw extends slightly forward, giving the face a distinct shape that's hard to ignore. Now here is the challenge. If you paint it exactly as it appears, the portrait may look less flattering than the royal court prefers. If you hide it entirely, the painting may not resemble the monarch at all. And an inaccurate portrait is dangerous business. After all, if the king's mother looks at the finished painting and says, "That does not look like my son," your career may end faster than a candle in a windy corridor. So you compromise. You adjust the lighting slightly, you turn the head at a careful angle. Maybe you soften the jawline with shadow, or add a luxurious collar that subtly draws attention away from the chin. Artists become experts in this quiet balancing act. Not deception, just artistic diplomacy. But the real difficulty appears over time, because once you've painted several Habsburg rulers, you begin to notice something strange. The faces are similar, very similar. You paint one archduke and think, interesting jawline. Then a few years later you paint his son with the same jawline. Then perhaps a cousin also with the same distinctive profile. Eventually you begin to suspect that if you lined up all your portraits side by side, they might look like slightly different versions of the same person. And in many royal galleries today, that's almost exactly what you see. Row after row of Habsburg rulers stare out from their frames. The clothing changes with the centuries. The armour becomes more elaborate. The wigs grow larger. The ruffs around the neck become so wide they look like someone attached a decorative dinner plate to the collar. But the faces remain unmistakably related. The protruding jaw, the long narrow cheeks, the lips that often sit slightly parted because the lower jaw makes closing the mouth comfortably complicated. Modern historians and geneticists have studied these portraits carefully, because unlike written descriptions, paintings capture physical details in remarkable ways, and across those centuries of portraits, the same pattern keeps appearing. Generation after generation. The Habsburg look. Of course, at the time, nobody fully understands why. There are whispers, of course. Courtiers sometimes joke quietly about how easy it is to recognize a Habsburg from across the room. Diplomats describe the distinctive family resemblance in letters sent back to their kings. But the idea that marriage patterns might be shaping the dynasty's appearance, that thought doesn't fully exist yet. Instead, the portraits continue. Another king, another painting, another careful angle of the head. And somewhere in a quiet palace gallery, if you stand long enough and study the faces staring back at you from centuries of gilded frames, you may start to notice something the painters themselves probably realized long ago. In the Habsburg dynasty, the family resemblance was not subtle. If you attended a Habsburg royal wedding, you might notice something unusual about the guest list. Nearly everyone present was somehow related to the bride, the groom, or both. In some cases, family ties looped back in such complex ways that genealogists today need entire charts just to keep track of who was whose cousin. Now imagine you're standing inside a vast cathedral on the morning of one of these weddings. Sunlight spills through stained glass windows, painting the stone floor in colours of red, gold, and deep blue. The church is filled with nobles wearing embroidered cloaks, glittering jewellery, and expressions that suggest they've spent the last hour trying to remember exactly how they're related to everyone else in the room. Because here's the thing about Habsburg weddings. They were less like introducing two families, and more like reuniting one extremely large, extremely complicated one. You glance down the rows of guests. That duke from Spain, a cousin. The Archduchess from Vienna, also a cousin. The prince standing near the altar, a cousin who might also be a second cousin depending on which branch of the family tree you follow. Even the witnesses signing the marriage contract are probably relatives. If this sounds confusing, that's because it was. Even in the 1500s, royal advisors needed written genealogies just to keep track of the dynasty's internal connections. Large parchment charts were kept in palace archives, carefully mapping the marriages, births and alliances that linked the Habsburg family across Europe. Without them, planning the next royal marriage would be nearly impossible. Imagine trying to arrange a politically useful wedding when half the eligible candidates already share your great-grandparents. Somewhere in a quiet office of the palace, a royal genealogist sits hunched over a desk covered in ink, quills and scrolls. Their job is to trace every noble bloodline, confirming who is related to whom and how closely. It's less like family history and more like advanced mathematics. A typical conversation might go something like this. Could the prince marry the princess of that branch? Well, technically yes, though they share two sets of grandparents. What about a cousin? Also related, through 3 different lines. And the Archduchess from Spain. Still a cousin, just a slightly different one. Eventually someone shrugs and says the words that seem to solve most Habsburg problems, close enough. And so another marriage is arranged. To be fair, the logic still makes sense from a political perspective. Every royal wedding strengthens alliances. Within the dynasty, the crowns of Spain and Austria remain linked. The territories stay within the same extended family. And as long as the empire remains stable, no one has much reason to question the system. The wedding itself is a magnificent spectacle. Choirs sing. Nobles toast the couple. Courtiers whisper about future heirs who will one day inherit enormous stretches of Europe. Meanwhile, the newly married couple stands quietly before the altar, likely aware that their union is less about personal happiness and more about the long-term stability of an empire. Romance is optional, dynastic strategy is not. As the years pass, the web of royal relatives grows even denser. Children are born who inherit connections from multiple branches of the family. Cousins become spouses, nephews become political allies. Entire regions of Europe become tied together through bloodlines that loop and twist like vines climbing a castle wall. To the outside world, the Habsburg dynasty appears incredibly powerful. Their relatives occupy thrones across the continent. Their influence reaches from Spain to Austria and beyond. Their network of family alliances makes them one of the most dominant royal houses in history. But if you step back and examine that tangled web of marriages carefully, something becomes clear. The family tree is no longer spreading outward, it's folding inward, and everyone inside the cathedral celebrating this royal wedding, every smiling duke, every elegant princess, every ambassador raising a goblet of wine, is standing inside a dynasty that is slowly becoming one very large, very complicated family reunion. King Philip II of Spain continued the tradition of strategic family marriages. His unions reinforced alliances within the Habsburg network, further concentrating power within the dynasty. But each generation narrowed the genetic pool even more, unknowingly increasing the risk of hereditary conditions. You now find yourself in the court of Philip II, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. His empire stretches across Spain, large parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and enormous territories in the Americas. Ships loaded with silver sail across the Atlantic under his authority. Entire continents answer, at least on paper, to his crown. From the outside, Philip's rule looks like the peak of Habsburg power. But inside the palace, the same dynastic strategy continues quietly, almost automatically. Marriage is still the key to everything. Philip himself marries several times throughout his life, and each marriage carries enormous political weight. His first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, is not a stranger from a distant kingdom. She is his cousin, more precisely a double cousin, meaning they share grandparents on both sides of the family. In modern terms, this is about as genetically close as royal marriages could get, without people starting to look very uncomfortable at the family tree. But in the mid-1500s, this arrangement seems perfectly reasonable. Portugal is powerful, wealthy, and closely tied to Spain. Keeping the alliance inside the extended family feels safe, predictable, and politically smart. The wedding is celebrated with the usual royal spectacle, ceremonies, feasts, and hopeful expectations that the couple will produce strong heirs to carry the dynasty forward. And they do produce a son, Prince Don Carlos. At first, the birth is celebrated like any royal arrival. Bells ring, courtiers congratulate the king. Another generation of the Habsburg line has begun. But as Don Carlos grows older, people around the court begin noticing that something isn't quite right. The prince struggles with both physical and behavioural difficulties. Historical accounts describe him as unpredictable, sickly, and often unstable. Some historians today believe his health problems were influenced by the increasingly close genetic relationships within the Habsburg line. At the time, however, no one understands this. Instead, courtiers whisper about personality flaws, bad temper, divine punishment, or simply unfortunate fate. Doctors prescribe treatments that include rest, herbs, prayers, and the occasional medical practice that probably made things worse. The situation becomes so troubling that Philip eventually confines his own son to his chambers, fearing that the prince's erratic behaviour could endanger the stability of the kingdom. It's a grim reminder that dynastic politics can become deeply personal. But even as these problems appear within the royal family, the marriage strategy itself does not change. Philip continues arranging alliances that keep power within the Habsburg network. Later marriages tie Spain even more closely to the Austrian branch of the dynasty. One of his most famous marriages is to Anna of Austria, his own niece. From the perspective of the royal court, this again makes perfect political sense. It strengthens the connection between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the family and ensures that control of their vast territories remains firmly within Habsburg hands. No one stops to think about the long-term biological consequences. After all, the empire still appears strong. The fleet still sail. The silver from the Americas still pours into Spanish ports. Diplomats still bow before the King of Spain, whose authority stretches farther than almost any ruler before him, but quietly, generation by generation, the circle tightens. Each new marriage inside the dynasty reduces the diversity of the family line just a little more. Each new royal child carries more of the same inherited traits from the same ancestors. None of this is intentional. To Philip II and his advisors, they are simply protecting the dynasty. They are keeping the empire united, the crowns connected, and the bloodline royal. And for now, it still works. The Habsburgs remain one of the most powerful families in the world, but the family tree is growing, increasingly narrow, and the consequences of that narrowing will become much harder to ignore in the generations that follow. By the late 1500s, some European observers had begun whispering about the unusual features and health problems appearing among Habsburg rulers. But openly criticising a royal dynasty was dangerous business. So the gossip stayed quiet, murmured in court corridors and diplomatic letters. You find yourself standing in a long stone hallway of a royal palace, the kind where footsteps echo softly and conversations are carefully kept just below the level of a whisper. Torches flicker along the walls, and somewhere nearby a pair of nobles pause beside a window, speaking in the cautious tone people use when the subject might be sensitive. Because by this point, people have started noticing things. Nothing dramatic at first, just observations. A prince who grows slowly, a royal child who struggles with illness, a familiar shape of the face that appears again and again across different branches of the family. None of these things are spoken aloud during official ceremonies, of course. No ambassador walks into a throne room and announces, "Your Majesty, the family resemblance is becoming extremely noticeable." That would be a very short diplomatic career. Instead, the conversations happen in private spaces, at dinner tables after the king has left the room, in letters sent quietly between diplomats, in small groups of nobles leaning close together near the fireplace. The tone is always careful. because criticizing a ruling dynasty, especially one as powerful as the Habsburgs, is a dangerous habit to develop. This is a family that controls enormous territories. Their relatives sit on thrones across Europe, their armies defend vast empires, and their political alliances stretch from Spain to Austria and beyond. So if you're going to discuss the unusual traits appearing within the royal family, you do it carefully, very carefully. Imagine a foreign ambassador writing a letter home to his king. He dips his quill into ink and begins describing the court he's just visited. The King of Spain, he writes, is dignified and powerful. The palace is magnificent. The empire is wealthy. Then, perhaps near the bottom of the letter, the tone changes slightly. He notes that the royal family bears a very strong resemblance to one another. Very strong. Perhaps he describes the distinctive jawline that appears in several members of the dynasty. Perhaps he mentions that some royal children seem delicate in health. He does not accuse anyone of anything. He simply observes, and the letter is sealed and sent across Europe, where another royal court reads it with interest. Soon similar letters begin appearing from other ambassadors as well. Reports from Vienna, reports from Madrid, reports from Brussels, each one describing the same subtle pattern. Now, at this moment in history, nobody fully understands what they are witnessing. The science of genetics will not exist for another 2 centuries. No one can draw the connection between repeated cousin marriages and inherited physical traits. But human beings are very good at noticing patterns, and the pattern here is becoming difficult to ignore. Meanwhile, the Habsburg court continues operating as it always has. Royal weddings are celebrated with enormous ceremony. Princes and princesses are born to great fanfare. The empire continues functioning with impressive efficiency, its territories governed by loyal officials and powerful nobles. From the outside, the dynasty still appears incredibly strong. But inside the quiet corners of European courts, the whispers continue. A diplomat raises an eyebrow during a dinner conversation. A noblewoman quietly comments on a royal portrait. A visiting physician writes down observations he cannot quite explain. None of them say it openly, not yet. Because when a family controls half of Europe, criticizing them is not simply rude, it's politically dangerous. Still, the rumours travel, softly, carefully, moving from palace to palace like smoke drifting through long corridors. And with each passing generation, those whispers grow just a little louder. Because even without the language of modern science, more and more people are beginning to suspect that something unusual is happening inside the most powerful family in Europe. They just don't yet know how serious the problem might become. Modern geneticists studying Habsburg genealogy discovered something remarkable. Many branches of the family tree loop back into themselves repeatedly. In some cases, an ancestor appears multiple times within the same lineage. This dramatically increased what scientists call the inbreeding coefficient. Now imagine a massive wooden table in a quiet archive room. On that table lies a gigantic family chart stretching so far across the surface that you need to lean over it just to follow the lines. Names are written in careful ink, connected by branches meant to represent generations. At first, it looks like any ordinary family tree. Parents lead to children. Children branch into new families. The lines spread outward like the limbs of an oak tree reaching into the sky. Except this tree doesn't behave like a tree. Follow one branch long enough and something strange happens. The line bends back. A cousin marries another cousin. That union reconnects 2 branches that were already linked several generations earlier. Then their children marry yet another relative, tying the same branches together again. Soon the chart stops looking like a tree at all. It begins to resemble a loop, or as some historians have joked, a genealogical pretzel. To understand just how unusual this is, imagine drawing your own family tree. Most people can trace their ancestry outward through dozens of different individuals. Great-grandparents come from different regions, different families, sometimes entirely different countries, but inside the Habsburg dynasty, the pool of ancestors becomes smaller and smaller with each generation. The same names appear again and again: Ferdinand, Philip, Maria, Joanna. At certain points in the family chart, a single ancestor appears multiple times in the same person's lineage. It's like seeing the same face pop up repeatedly in a group photo. Modern scientists have studied these patterns carefully. By examining birth records, marriage contracts, and royal genealogies, researchers have calculated something called the inbreeding coefficient. Now, that term sounds a bit technical, but the idea behind it is simple. It measures how closely related a person's parents are. If two distant relatives marry, the number is relatively small. If cousins marry, the number increases. If uncle-niece marriages occur repeatedly across generations, the number rises dramatically. And in the case of the later Habsburg rulers, that number becomes surprisingly high. Some researchers have estimated that the genetic relatedness in certain generations was comparable to what you might see if siblings had children together. Now, to be clear, siblings were not marrying each other in the Habsburg dynasty, but the repeated cousin and uncle-niece marriages across centuries created a similar effect. It's like folding a piece of paper over itself again and again until the layers become extremely thick. Each generation carries more and more of the same inherited traits, and because these marriages were meant to keep power within the dynasty, the pattern continues for decades. Royal advisors see no reason to stop. The empire still appears stable. The crowns remain inside the family. The political system seems to work. From their perspective, the strategy is successful, but biology is quietly keeping track of the numbers. While kings and queens are thinking about alliances and territory, something else is happening beneath the surface. The genetic diversity of the dynasty is slowly shrinking. And when diversity shrinks, certain traits, especially harmful ones, have a higher chance of appearing. The Habsburg court, of course, has no way of understanding this. To them, the family tree simply represents prestige. Each connection proves how deeply the dynasty is woven into the royal fabric of Europe. But if you step back and examine that chart from a modern perspective, the pattern becomes unmistakable. The lines twist and reconnect. Branches fold inward. The tree no longer spreads outward across new families. Instead, it curls back on itself again and again until the royal family tree begins to look less like a tree and much more like a circle. As centuries passed, certain traits appeared again and again in royal descendants. Physical features like the jaw became more pronounced. Health problems became more common. But because the Habsburgs continued marrying within the same circle, the pattern only intensified. Imagine walking through a long palace, gallery late in the evening. The candles burn low and the walls are lined with portraits of the dynasty stretching back generations. Kings, queens, princes, archdukes, rows and rows of carefully painted faces watching you from golden frames. At first, they all look like individuals, but the longer you stare, the more they begin to resemble one another. The same shape of the jaw appears again, the same narrow face, the same slightly parted lips. It's almost like watching the same portrait being painted again and again, only with different clothing and different hairstyles depending on the century. This is what historians now call the genetic echo of the Habsburg dynasty. Traits don't just appear once, they repeat. They travel through generations like a melody being passed down through time. And in a family where marriages repeatedly happen within the same circle of relatives, those traits become louder with every generation. At first, the differences are subtle. A prince might have a slightly longer jawline than his father. A princess might share the same distinctive facial structure as several of her cousins. Court artists learn how to capture these similarities while still presenting the ruler in a flattering light. But as the centuries pass, the features become harder to disguise. The famous Habsburg jaw grows more pronounced. Some members of the family struggle with dental alignment or chewing. Others develop health issues that palace doctors struggle to explain. Of course, the doctors of the time do not have modern medicine. Their explanations revolve around humours, diet, divine favour, and the occasional unlucky star alignment. If a royal child falls ill, the court physicians prescribe herbs, tonics, and sometimes treatments that would make a modern doctor slowly back away from the room. But none of these remedies address the real reason the traits keep repeating. Because the dynasty continues the same marriage strategy. Every generation still believes it is protecting the empire. The crowns of Spain and Austria must remain in Habsburg hands. Political alliances must stay within the trusted circle of relatives. Marrying outside the dynasty risks handing power to rival families, so the system continues. Another cousin marriage, another carefully arranged wedding, another generation of royal children born into the same narrowing bloodline, and with each generation, the genetic echoes grow stronger. Imagine dropping a pebble into a quiet pond. The ripples spread outward in widening circles. Now imagine those ripples bouncing off the edges of the pond and returning again and again, overlapping and strengthening each other. That is what is happening inside the Habsburg family tree. The same traits keep returning, reinforced by each new marriage within the dynasty. To the outside world, the Habsburg Empire still appears magnificent. The relatives sit on multiple thrones. Their armies guard vast territories. Their influence shapes European politics for centuries. But inside the royal bloodline, something quieter is happening. The genetic deck is slowly being reshuffled with fewer and fewer cards, and eventually the effects will become impossible to ignore. Because when traits echo through generation after generation without new diversity entering the family line, those echoes grow louder. Loud enough that even the most loyal courtiers, the most careful portrait painters, and the most diplomatic ambassadors will eventually begin to notice. And the next generation of Habsburg rulers will carry those echoes more strongly than any before them. And now we arrive at the most famous example of Habsburg inbreeding, Charles II of Spain. When he was born in 1661, the dynasty had already spent generations marrying relatives. Charles would inherit not just the Spanish crown, but the full genetic consequences of that tradition. Picture the royal palace in Madrid on a cool November morning. Servants hurry through candlelit corridors, whispering to one another as the palace doctors and midwives move quickly toward the Queen's chamber. The air is thick with anticipation, because the Queen is about to give birth. And when you belong to the most powerful dynasty in Europe, the birth of a royal child is not just a family event, it's a political earthquake. Outside the palace, church bells wait to ring. Courtiers gather in nearby rooms, pretending to drink wine calmly while secretly calculating the future of the Spanish Empire. Spain at this moment still controls enormous territories across Europe, across the Atlantic, and across oceans most people in the palace will never see. The empire needs an heir, a strong one, because the previous generations of Habsburg rulers have already faced too many tragedies, infant deaths, sickly children, princes who never lived long enough to inherit the throne. So when the cries of a newborn echo through the palace chambers, a wave of relief sweeps through the court. A prince has been born. His name is Charles. At first the court celebrates as expected. Messengers race through the streets announcing the good news. Bells ring across Madrid. Nobles congratulate one another with great enthusiasm. But even in those early days, something feels fragile. Charles is small, delicate, and unlike many royal babies, his development seems unusually slow. The palace physicians gather around the cradle, whispering quietly among themselves. They do what doctors of the 1600s always do when faced with medical mysteries. They speculate. Perhaps the child simply needs stronger nourishment. Perhaps the stars were misaligned at his birth. Perhaps a change in climate will help strengthen his constitution. Because no one yet understands the real cause. To see that cause, you would need to step back and examine Charles's family tree. And if you did, the picture would be astonishing. Charles's father, King Philip IV of Spain, married Marianne of Austria, who was not just a distant royal connection. She was his niece, which means Charles's parents were uncle and niece, a marriage that had already become disturbingly common within the Habsburg dynasty. But the story goes even deeper than that. When modern historians and geneticists later studied Charles's ancestry, they discovered something extraordinary. The number of repeated ancestors in his lineage was so high that his genetic profile resembled what you might expect from the child of siblings. Again, this was not because siblings had married directly. It was the result of generations of cousin marriages stacking upon one another like layers in a cake that had been baked far too many times. By the time Charles was born, the dynasty's genetic diversity had shrunk dramatically, and Charles carried the consequences. As he grew older, the signs became impossible to ignore. He struggled to walk until he was several years old. His speech developed slowly. His health remained fragile throughout childhood. And of course, there was the most visible trait of all, the famous Habsburg jaw. In Charles II, the feature reached its most dramatic form. His lower jaw protruded so far that he reportedly had difficulty chewing food properly and sometimes struggled to close his mouth comfortably. Portrait painters, as always, did their best. They adjusted angles, they softened shadows. But even the most loyal court artist could only disguise so much. Still, none of this changes the reality inside the palace. Charles is the king, or rather, he will be. Because no matter how fragile the boy appears, the Spanish Empire depends on him. The dynasty that spent centuries carefully arranging marriages to preserve its power now finds itself facing the ultimate irony. All that careful protection of the bloodline has created an heir who may struggle to carry it forward. But for now, as the young prince sleeps in his royal cradle beneath velvet curtains and flickering candlelight, the court continues to hope, because the fate of one of the largest empires in the world now rests on the shoulders of a very small and very fragile king. From the moment Charles II entered the world, it was clear something was wrong. He struggled with health problems almost immediately. He learned to walk late. He struggled to speak. Court physicians constantly surrounded him, trying to keep the fragile young king alive. Now, imagine growing up in the Spanish royal palace as that child. The halls are enormous, filled with tapestries, polished marble floors, and servants who bow whenever you pass. Outside the palace walls lies one of the largest empires in the world, but inside your nursery life is much smaller and much quieter. Because your body is fragile. As a baby, you fall ill frequently. Fevers appear and disappear like unwelcome guests. Nurses move carefully around your cradle, whispering prayers and adjusting blankets. Every cough sends a ripple of worry through the palace. The court physicians arrive constantly. In the 1600s, doctors are serious men with heavy robes, thoughtful expressions, and a medical toolkit that is, let's say, enthusiastic but not especially effective. They examine you carefully. They check your pulse. They discuss the balance of humours in your body, the medieval theory that illness comes from imbalances of blood, bile, and other mysterious fluids that nobody today would recommend measuring. Sometimes they prescribe herbal remedies. Sometimes they suggest special diets. Occasionally they bring out leeches, which in that era are considered a perfectly reasonable solution to almost everything. Unfortunately, none of these treatments address the real problem. Your development is slow. While other royal children are running through palace gardens, you struggle to walk. Historical records suggest Charles did not walk until he was around 4 years old. Even then, his movements are cautious and unsteady. Speech is difficult too. Words come slowly, and sometimes not at all. Courtiers who visit the young prince leave with quiet concerns they do not dare express openly. Because here is the uncomfortable truth no one wants to say out loud. The future king of Spain may not be strong enough to rule it. Yet the palace continues pretending everything is normal. Your education begins, though it moves slowly. Tutors attempt to teach you reading, writing, and the complex responsibilities of kingship. But lessons are often interrupted by illness, fatigue, or days when the young prince simply cannot concentrate. Meanwhile, the court waits, always waiting. Every improvement in your health is celebrated with enormous relief. A day without fever becomes a small victory. A few clear sentences spoken during a lesson might send courtiers hurrying down the corridor to report the encouraging news to the Queen. But the setbacks continue. The famous Habsburg jaw is already clearly visible, and it affects more than just appearance. The unusual structure of your face makes chewing difficult. Eating certain foods becomes a slow and careful process, something the royal kitchen must quietly adapt to. Picture the royal dining table: silver dishes, roasted meats, rich stews and delicate pastries are arranged before the young prince who will one day rule Spain, and yet every bite must be taken slowly, carefully, while doctors watch anxiously and servants stand ready with soft foods should the meal become too difficult. The entire empire, in a way, is holding its breath, because Charles is not just a child. He is the last major heir of the Spanish Habsburg line. If he survives and produces children of his own, the dynasty continues. If he does not, the enormous empire of Spain may fall into chaos, as rival European powers scramble to claim the throne. And so the palace surrounds him with constant care. Doctors hover nearby. Servants attend to his every need. Priests offer prayers for his health. Because the fragile boy moving slowly through the palace corridors is not just a sick child. He is the future of the Spanish Empire, and every cough, every fever, every difficult step reminds the court of a terrifying possibility. The dynasty that ruled half the world may now depend on the health of one very fragile king. Charles II's jaw became one of the most famous physical features in royal history. It was so pronounced that he reportedly had difficulty chewing food and speaking clearly. Portrait painters did their best, but even their careful brushwork couldn't hide the dramatic structure of his face. Now picture yourself entering the royal portrait room once again. The walls are covered with generations of Habsburg rulers, each staring out proudly from enormous frames. Armour gleams. Velvet collars bloom like giant fabric flowers around royal necks. Every painting is meant to project strength, authority, and divine confidence. And then there is Charles II. When artists paint the young king, they approach their task with the same careful diplomacy as their predecessors. Painting royalty is never just about accuracy, it's about presentation. A portrait must reassure allies, impress ambassadors, and remind everyone exactly who sits on the throne. But Charles presents a particular challenge. His lower jaw pushes forward so dramatically that it changes the entire balance of his face. The lips often remain slightly open, because closing the mouth comfortably is difficult. Even when he sits perfectly still for the painter, the structure of his jaw dominates the portrait. So the artists get creative. They angle his head slightly upward. They soften the shadows. They place rich clothing around his shoulders, massive lace collars, velvet cloaks, heavy chains of gold, to draw the eye away from the centre of the face. Sometimes the portrait shows Charles gazing off to the side, which conveniently hides the full profile. But no matter how carefully the brush moves, the famous Habsburg feature refuses to disappear, because Charles doesn't just have the Habsburg jaw, he has the most extreme version the dynasty has ever produced. Modern historians believe the condition affected more than appearance. The unusual alignment of his jaw made chewing difficult, which meant meals were often a slow and awkward process. Now imagine the royal dining hall. A long table stretches across the room, filled with nobles, ministers, and foreign ambassadors. Silver plates hold roasted meats, stews, breads, fruits, and delicacies from across the empire. Servants glide quietly between guests, refilling goblets of wine. At the head of the table sits the king. Charles must eat carefully. Certain foods are difficult to chew. Conversations at the table sometimes pause while he works slowly through a meal. Of course, no one comments on this openly. The king's dignity must always remain intact. Courtiers simply continue their conversations about politics, trade, or war while pretending that the situation is perfectly normal. But visitors notice. Foreign diplomats quietly describe the king in letters sent back to their own courts. They write about his fragile health, his slow speech, and yes, the remarkable shape of his jaw. These descriptions spread across Europe. Soon Charles II becomes known not just as the King of Spain, but as the final and most dramatic example of the Habsburg family resemblance. Even the court physicians are aware that the king's physical condition is unusual, but their explanations remain rooted in the medical beliefs of the 1600s. They blame weak digestion, poor balance of bodily humours, or simply unfortunate luck. The idea that generations of intermarriage might have contributed to these traits is not something anyone in the palace fully understands. So life continues as usual. The king attends court ceremonies. He listens to advisors discuss matters of empire. He appears in official portraits that are sent to foreign rulers as symbols of Spain's authority. But every painting, every description, every quiet whisper in royal courts across Europe reinforces the same reality. The Habsburg dynasty, once famous for its vast empire and powerful alliances, now has another unmistakable symbol, a jawline so distinctive that it becomes legendary. And as Charles grows older, that famous jaw will become more than just a curiosity. It will become a visible reminder of the centuries of family decisions that shaped the destiny of the Spanish throne. Despite being crowned king, Charles II was often too sick to rule effectively. Advisors, regents, and courtiers handled much of the actual governing. Meanwhile, the Spanish Empire, once one of the most powerful in Europe, began slowly weakening. Now imagine the royal court in Madrid during one of Charles's early years as king. The palace is enormous, filled with ministers, generals, priests and diplomats moving through long corridors, beneath painted ceilings. Important decisions must be made every day. Wars negotiated, taxes collected, colonies governed across oceans. And somewhere inside this enormous machine of empire sits the king. Or rather, sometimes the king sits. Sometimes he lies down. Sometimes he simply doesn't appear at all, because Charles II spends much of his life battling illness. Fevers come and go. Fatigue is constant. On certain days he can attend council meetings. On many others he cannot. So the government quietly adjusts. You step into the royal council chamber. Around the table sit powerful men, nobles with titles longer than their patience, church officials with serious expressions, and ministers carrying stacks of documents from across the empire. They begin discussing matters of state, trade routes in the Americas, military threats from France, financial problems that seem to multiply every year. The king listens when he can, but often the discussions unfold around him rather than through him. Advisors speak carefully, guiding decisions while maintaining the appearance that everything flows from royal authority, because the illusion of strong kingship must remain intact. No empire wants the world to think its ruler is fragile. In practice, much of the real governing falls to regents, ministers, and influential court factions. Power shifts quietly behind the scenes as different groups try to influence the direction of the empire. If this sounds a bit chaotic, that's because it is. Spain during the late 1600s still controls vast territories, but the empire is under pressure. Wars have drained enormous resources. Trade systems are strained. Rival European powers, especially France under Louis XIV, are growing stronger and more ambitious. And at the centre of all this sits a king who struggles simply to stay healthy. Now, imagine attending one of Charles's rare public appearances. The court gathers in elaborate ceremonial halls. Nobles line the walls, while musicians play soft music somewhere near the balconies. The king enters slowly. He moves carefully, often supported by attendants. His health and physical weakness are visible to those watching closely. Yet everyone bows deeply as he passes, because despite everything, Charles II remains the King of Spain. The ceremony continues exactly as tradition demands. Titles are announced, petitions are presented, diplomats exchange formal greetings. But behind the pageantry, everyone understands that the true stability of the empire depends on the people surrounding the throne rather than the man sitting on it. Meanwhile, rumours circulate quietly throughout Europe. Foreign ambassadors write home describing the situation. They note the king's fragile health, the political manoeuvring among Spanish nobles, and the growing uncertainty about the future of the dynasty. Because one question hangs over every diplomatic conversation. What happens when Charles dies? The king has no children, and if he leaves no heir, the Spanish Empire, one of the largest political structures in the world, will suddenly become the most valuable prize in Europe. France will want it. Austria will want it. Other powers will want to prevent either side from becoming too powerful. In other words, the moment Charles II's reign ends, Europe may find itself staring directly at a massive international crisis. Inside the palace, however, life continues with careful routine. Doctors monitor the king's health. Advisors continue running the government. Courtiers maintain the elegant ceremonies expected of the Spanish court. But as the years pass, the truth becomes harder and harder to ignore. The empire that once dominated Europe now rests on the shoulders of a ruler who can barely carry his own weight through the palace corridors. And the future of that empire grows more uncertain with every passing year. 17th century doctors had no concept of genetics. Instead, they blamed Charles's problems on humours, diet, divine punishment, or bad air. Treatments included potions, prayers, and the occasional questionable medical procedure. Now imagine yourself stepping quietly into the king's chamber on a typical morning. The curtains are drawn to keep the room calm and dim. The air smells faintly of herbs, incense, and the slightly nervous sweat of several very serious physicians trying their best to look confident. Around the bed stand the royal doctors. They whisper to one another in careful Latin phrases, nodding thoughtfully as they examine the fragile king. In the 17th century, medicine is less about laboratories and more about theories that sound impressive when spoken slowly. The most popular theory involves the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. According to medical tradition, illness occurs when these mysterious fluids fall out of balance. So if Charles is weak, perhaps he has too much phlegm. If he is tired, perhaps too much black bile. If he has a fever, clearly the blood is misbehaving. And if none of those explanations quite work well, there is always the weather. Yes, bad air is a perfectly respectable medical diagnosis in 1600. The doctors debate all of this while occasionally glancing toward the king, who sits patiently through examinations that range from mildly uncomfortable to impressively bizarre. One physician recommends a special herbal mixture brewed from roots, leaves, and something that may or may not have once been a frog. Another suggests a change in diet. Less meat, perhaps, or more meat. Opinions vary. Then there are the treatments involving bloodletting. At the time, removing blood from the body is believed to restore balance, so the doctors may produce a small blade or a collection of leeches, nature's very own portable medical staff. These creatures are applied carefully to the patient, where they perform their tiny but enthusiastic work while the doctors observe with professional satisfaction. From their perspective, this is excellent medicine. From Charles's perspective, it is probably a long afternoon. Prayers are also involved, because the line between medicine and religion is extremely thin in this era. Priests sometimes visit the king to bless him, pray for divine healing, or remind everyone that illness can be part of God's mysterious plan. In fairness to the doctors, they are not careless or cruel. Many of them genuinely want to help their king. They study the best medical texts available, debate treatments with one another, and observe Charles closely. The problem is simply that the real explanation for his condition is centuries away from being discovered. They cannot see chromosomes, they do not understand inherited traits, and the idea that generations of royal cousin marriages might be influencing the king's health would sound more like an insult than a medical theory. So they continue searching for answers in the tools they do understand: herbs, diets, bloodletting, prayer, and occasionally a recommendation that the king spend time breathing fresher air, which in palace terms usually means opening a window and hoping for the best. Meanwhile, Charles endures all of this with quiet patience. Royal life has never been especially comfortable, but medical treatments of the 17th century add a special layer of inconvenience. Every new illness brings another consultation. Every fever invites another theory. Every physician arrives convinced he has finally solved the mystery. Yet the mystery remains. Because while the doctors argue about humours and air quality, the true cause of the king's condition lies hidden deep inside the family tree, woven through generations of royal marriages that no one in the room fully understands. And until science catches up with history, the physicians of the Spanish court will continue doing what they can, mixing potions, offering prayers, and occasionally placing a very determined leech on the arm of the most powerful king in Europe. Charles II faced another enormous problem. He struggled to produce an heir. For a dynasty obsessed with bloodlines, this was a looming disaster. Without a successor, the Spanish throne would become the centre of a massive European power struggle. Now imagine the mood inside the Spanish royal court as the years pass. At first, people remain optimistic. Charles is still young. Royal marriages often take time to produce children. Courtiers whisper reassuring phrases in the palace halls. There is still plenty of time. But time, as it turns out, has a habit of moving forward whether empires are ready or not. Charles marries Maria Louisa of Orléans, a French princess chosen partly to ease tensions between Spain and France. The wedding is celebrated with enormous ceremony, music, feasts, fireworks, and speeches about the bright future of the Spanish dynasty. Everyone smiles politely, but everyone is thinking the same thing. An heir, preferably a healthy one. Every month without news of a pregnancy quietly raises the level of anxiety inside the palace. The royal doctors monitor the queen carefully. Court officials watch for any hint that a child may be on the way. When months turn into years, the optimism begins to fade. Rumours begin circulating in court corridors. Some whisper that the king's health makes fatherhood difficult. Others claim the queen may be unable to conceive. A few superstitious courtiers blame curses, bad omens, or the alignment of the planets, because in the absence of clear answers, people will invent explanations. Eventually, Maria Luisa dies without producing a child. Charles remarries, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg. Once again, the court fills with cautious hope. Surely this time the dynasty will produce an heir. Surely the Spanish throne will not be left empty. But the years pass again. Still no child, and slowly the realization spreads through the royal court like cold air, creeping through the palace walls. There may be no successor. Now this is not merely a family problem. This is a continental emergency. Spain at this time is still one of the largest empires in the world. Its territories include Spain itself, the Spanish Netherlands, parts of Italy, and a vast overseas empire stretching across the Americas and beyond. If Charles dies without a clear heir, the question becomes unavoidable. Who inherits all of that? And suddenly every royal family in Europe develops a strong interest in the health of the King of Spain. The French monarchy believes it has a claim through family connections. The Austrian Habsburgs believe the empire should remain within their branch of the dynasty. Other European powers watch nervously, hoping neither side becomes too powerful. Because if one ruler suddenly inherits the entire Spanish Empire, the balance of power in Europe could collapse overnight. Diplomats begin writing increasingly urgent letters. Secret negotiations take place behind closed doors. European courts quietly discuss possible inheritance arrangements while pretending everything is perfectly calm. Inside the Spanish palace, the atmosphere becomes tense. Advisors gather around the king more frequently, discussing succession plans in cautious language. Some propose dividing the empire among several heirs to avoid a massive war. Others argue that the throne must pass entirely to a single ruler to preserve stability. Meanwhile, Charles himself continues living inside the centre of this growing storm. He attends ceremonies, he listens to advisors, he hears the endless discussions about succession, alliances, and possible heirs, all while knowing the uncomfortable truth. The future of the Spanish Empire depends on something he cannot provide, and as the king grows older, the urgency increases. Europe begins preparing for the inevitable, because when the heirless king finally dies, the question of who inherits Spain will not be decided quietly. It will be decided by the ambitions of kings, the calculations of diplomats, and eventually the marching of armies. By the late 1600s, European powers were quietly preparing for the inevitable. If Charles died without children, the Spanish Empire, one of the largest on earth, would suddenly be up for grabs. Now imagine the mood across Europe during these final years of Charles II's reign. Kings, princes, and diplomats are watching Spain the way people watch a very fragile vase sitting on the edge of a table. Everyone knows it will eventually fall. The only question is what happens when it does. Inside royal courts from Paris to Vienna, conversations begin with the same quiet question. How is the King of Spain feeling today? And no one asking that question is actually worried about his health. They are worried about his death. Because when Charles II dies, the fate of the Spanish Empire will suddenly become the most important political prize in the world. Spain is still enormous. Its territories stretch across Europe, including the Spanish Netherlands and large parts of Italy. Across the Atlantic, Spain controls vast lands in the Americas, filled with silver mines and colonial cities. Its fleets still cross oceans, carrying wealth that finances armies and royal courts. Whoever inherits Spain will instantly become one of the most powerful rulers on earth, which means every major dynasty in Europe is quietly preparing their argument. In France, King Louis XIV watches closely. Through family connections, his grandson has a claim to the Spanish throne. If France and Spain were united under the same royal house, it would create a superpower capable of dominating the continent. Naturally, the rest of Europe finds this idea extremely alarming. Meanwhile, the Austrian branch of the Habsburg family believes the throne should remain within their side of the dynasty. After all, they share the same royal bloodline. From their perspective, allowing France to inherit Spain would be a political disaster. So diplomats begin meeting, not publicly of course. These discussions happen behind closed doors in quiet chambers filled with maps and legal documents. Advisors argue over ancient family ties, marriage contracts, and inheritance rights that stretch back generations. Everyone is trying to answer the same question: who deserves the Spanish crown? The problem is that the answer changes depending on which royal family you ask. France says one thing, Austria says another. England and the Dutch Republic worry that either outcome might upset the balance of power in Europe. They begin discussing ways to prevent any single country from becoming too dominant. So plans are drawn, secret treaties are proposed, maps are studied carefully as diplomats considered dividing the Spanish Empire into pieces, giving different territories to different rulers in order to avoid a massive war. But these plans all share one uncomfortable reality. None of them can happen while Charles II is still alive. So Europe waits. Ambassadors continue sending reports back to their kings. The Spanish monarch appears weak today. His health remains uncertain. Doctors fear another illness. Each letter is read carefully by rulers who understand exactly what is coming. Inside the Spanish palace, Charles continues his daily routine. He attends court ceremonies when he can. Advisors bring him reports from across the empire. Courtiers bow deeply as the king passes through the halls. But outside Spain, the patience of Europe grows thinner. Armies are quietly strengthened. Alliances are discussed. And every royal court keeps one eye fixed on Madrid. Because everyone understands that the moment Charles II dies, the question of who inherits the Spanish Empire will no longer be solved by letters or diplomacy. It will be solved by the ambitions of kings. And if those ambitions collide, the entire continent may soon find itself marching toward war. In 1700, Charles II finally died after a lifetime of illness. With his death, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty came to an end. The centuries-long experiment in dynastic inbreeding had reached its final chapter. Now imagine the palace in Madrid during those final days. The corridors are unusually quiet. Servants move softly across the marble floors. Doctors pass in and out of the king's chambers with the heavy, serious expressions of men who already know how the story will end. Charles II has been sick most of his life, but now the illness has become impossible to hide. His body, fragile for decades, is finally giving up the long struggle. Inside the royal bedroom, candles flicker beside the bed. Priests stand nearby murmuring prayers. Advisors gather in small groups, whispering about matters that would normally be discussed in council chambers. Because everyone in the palace understands something. The moment Charles dies, everything will change. For weeks the court waits anxiously. The king grows weaker. Reports of his condition spread quickly beyond Spain. Ambassadors rush letters across Europe, informing their rulers that the end is near. In Paris, Vienna, London, and countless other capitals, kings and ministers read those letters with intense interest. They have been preparing for this moment for years. Finally, on November 1st, 1700, the long-awaited news arrives. Charles II is dead. The last Spanish Habsburg has passed away at the age of 38 after a lifetime of illness that had slowly drained his strength. Inside the palace, bells begin to toll. Courtiers dress in black. Religious ceremonies begin immediately. Nobles move through the halls with solemn faces, performing the rituals of royal mourning that have been practiced for centuries. But beneath the mourning lies something else. Urgency. Because Charles did leave a will, and that will names a successor. In one of the final political decisions of his life, Charles II chose Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV of France, to inherit the Spanish throne. In other words, the vast Spanish Empire is about to pass into the hands of the French Bourbon dynasty. From Charles's perspective, this decision might have seemed practical. Philip was young, healthy, and connected to the royal bloodline through family ties. Spain desperately needed a strong ruler after decades of uncertainty. But the rest of Europe sees the situation very differently. If Philip of Anjou becomes King Philip V of Spain while remaining closely tied to the French royal family, France and Spain could effectively unite under one powerful dynasty. And that possibility terrifies Europe, because such a union would create a superpower unlike anything the continent has ever seen. Inside Madrid, however, the transition begins quickly. Philip is proclaimed the new King of Spain. The Bourbon dynasty is about to replace the Habsburgs. And just like that, the royal family that had ruled Spain for nearly 2 centuries disappears from the throne. It's a quiet ending in some ways. There is no dramatic battlefield collapse, no palace stormed by rebels, no final heroic stand, just a sick king dying in his bed and a dynasty quietly coming to an end. But the consequences of that ending are enormous. Because while the Spanish Habsburg line may have ended peacefully in Madrid, the question of who truly controls the empire has just ignited a political fire across Europe. And very soon, kings and armies across the continent will begin moving to decide that question the only way European powers often knew how: with war. Charles's death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession. Major European powers fought to decide who would inherit Spain's massive empire. The conflict reshaped the balance of power across the continent. Now imagine the moment the news spreads across Europe. A courier gallops into Paris carrying the sealed message. Another arrives in Vienna. Ships carry copies of the announcement to London and Amsterdam. Royal advisors break open the letters, read the words carefully, and then slowly look up at their kings. The King of Spain is dead, and he has named a French prince as his successor. At first there is silence, then the arguments begin. In France, Louis XIV is delighted. His grandson, Philip of Anjou, has just been declared the new King of Spain. If the will is accepted, the Bourbon family will control 2 of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. Picture Louis XIV standing in the glittering halls of Versailles, surrounded by marble statues and mirrors reflecting endless candlelight. The French court celebrates the news with excitement. Another Bourbon now sits on a throne, and it is one of the most valuable thrones in the world. But across Europe, the reaction is far less enthusiastic. In Vienna, the Austrian Habsburgs read the news with disbelief. They believed the Spanish throne should remain within their side of the dynasty. After all, they share the same royal bloodline that ruled Spain for centuries. To them, handing the empire to France is unacceptable. Meanwhile, in England and the Dutch Republic, leaders begin calculating the consequences. If France and Spain become allies under the Bourbon family, their combined power could dominate Europe. Trade routes could shift, armies could grow unstoppable, the balance of power, Europe's delicate political system could collapse. So within months, alliances begin forming. England, the Dutch Republic, Austria and several other states unite in opposition to France. They support a different candidate for the Spanish throne, Archduke Charles of Austria. Suddenly, the question of who becomes King of Spain is no longer a matter of royal paperwork. It becomes a matter of war. And war in the early 1700s is not small. Imagine the continent lighting up with conflict. Armies march across Italy, the Netherlands, Germany, and Spain itself. Generals maneuver thousands of soldiers across muddy fields while diplomats scramble to keep fragile alliances from falling apart. Battles erupt across Europe. One of the most famous commanders of the war is the Duke of Marlborough, an English general whose victories against French forces become legendary. Together with his allies, he leads campaigns that stretch from the Low Countries to southern Germany. Entire regions become battlefields. Farmers watch armies march across their land. Cities brace for sieges. Supply wagons rattle along dusty roads carrying food, gunpowder, and the hopes of kings who believe victory will reshape the continent. Meanwhile, Philip V, the new Bourbon King of Spain, sits uneasily on his throne. Because although he has been crowned, half of Europe is fighting to remove him. The war drags on for more than a decade. 11 long years of battles, negotiations, victories and disasters. Millions of soldiers march. Thousands of lives are lost. Fortresses change hands again and again. And, eventually, something unexpected happens. In 1711, the Austrian candidate for the Spanish throne, Archduke Charles, suddenly inherits the title of Holy Roman Emperor, which creates a new problem. If he also becomes King of Spain, he would control an empire nearly as large as the one Europe was trying to prevent France from building. In other words, the solution to the war might create the exact same problem, so the exhausted powers of Europe finally decide to compromise. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht ends the war. Philip V is allowed to remain King of Spain, but with one important condition: the French and Spanish crowns can never unite under a single ruler. Spain keeps its monarchy, but it loses several territories across Europe. The balance of power is restored, more or less. And just like that, the death of a sick king without an heir has reshaped the entire continent. A dynasty has ended. A new one has begun. And Europe, after years of war, settles uneasily into a new political order, all because the Habsburg family tree finally ran out of branches. Centuries later, historians and geneticists began studying the Habsburg family tree in detail. Their research confirmed what observers had suspected. Repeated close marriages dramatically increased the dynasty's genetic risks. Now imagine yourself not in a candlelit palace, but in a quiet modern research library. The room smells faintly of old paper and polished wood. Instead of royal advisors and court physicians, the people gathered here are historians, geneticists and researchers, armed with laptops, notebooks and stacks of historical records. On the table in front of them lies the Habsburg family tree. It is enormous. If you tried to draw it on a single sheet of paper, you'd quickly run out of space. The chart spreads across multiple pages, filled with names, dates, marriages, and arrows connecting generation after generation of European royalty. At first glance it looks just impressive, a dynasty stretching across centuries. But the researchers studying it notice something strange almost immediately. The same names appear again, and again, and again. One ancestor shows up in several different places in the same lineage. Cousins marry cousins. Uncles marry nieces. Branches of the family tree reconnect repeatedly until the chart begins to resemble something closer to a tangled knot than a tree. Historians had suspected this pattern for a long time. Royal marriage records were well documented, and scholars had noticed how frequently the Habsburgs married within their own extended family. But modern genetic research allows scientists to go much further. By analysing genealogical records, researchers can calculate something called the inbreeding coefficient, a number that measures how closely related a person's parents are. For most people in the modern world, that number is extremely small. For the Habsburg dynasty, it becomes alarmingly high when scientists calculate the inbreeding coefficient for Charles II of Spain. The result is remarkable. His genetic relatedness is roughly equivalent to what you would expect if his parents had been siblings. Now, to be clear, Charles's parents were not siblings. His father married his niece, which was already a very close relationship, but that marriage came after generations of other cousin marriages layered on top of one another. It's like folding the same piece of paper again and again until the layers become impossibly thick. Eventually, the genetic material becomes extremely concentrated, and that concentration increases the chances that harmful inherited traits will appear. Researchers studying portraits and written descriptions of Habsburg rulers have also noticed how certain physical features repeat across generations. The famous Habsburg jaw is perhaps the most visible example. Medical experts now believe the trait was likely caused by inherited skeletal characteristics that became stronger through repeated intermarriage. But the jaw was only one symptom. Historical records also describe developmental delays, fragile health, and fertility problems in several members of the dynasty. In Charles II's case, these issues reached their most dramatic form. To modern scientists, the pattern now seems clear. The Habsburg marriage strategy, so successful politically, gradually reduced genetic diversity within the dynasty. Over time, this made it increasingly likely that recessive genetic conditions would appear. In other words, the very system designed to preserve the royal bloodline slowly weakened it. Of course, none of this was intentional. The kings and queens arranging these marriages believed they were protecting their empire. They had no understanding of genetics, chromosomes, or inherited conditions. Those discoveries would only come centuries later with the work of scientists like Gregor Mendel. But history sometimes reveals its lessons slowly, and when modern researchers finally mapped the full Habsburg genealogy, they discovered something extraordinary. An empire that once ruled half of Europe had quietly built one of the most famous genetic case studies in human history. Today, historians still study the Habsburg family tree not just as a political story, but as a reminder of how power, tradition, and biology can collide in unexpected ways. Because in the end, the Habsburg dynasty didn't collapse because of a single battle or a single king. It slowly folded inward generation after generation, until the family tree itself became part of the story. And so, the Habsburg story ends with an unusual lesson from history. A dynasty that mastered diplomacy, alliances, and empire building ultimately weakened itself through its own marriage strategy. In trying to preserve their bloodline, the Habsburgs slowly trapped themselves inside it. Now imagine walking one final time through the halls of a Habsburg palace. The torches burn low along the stone walls. Portraits of emperors and kings line the corridors, their painted eyes following you quietly as you pass. Each face represents another generation that once ruled vast territories: Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, Italy, and lands far beyond Europe. At their height, the Habsburgs were everywhere. Their relatives sat on more thrones than almost any dynasty in history. Their empire stretched across continents. Their name carried enormous political weight. And the method that built this empire was surprisingly simple: marriage. Instead of conquering every territory with armies, the Habsburgs conquered with wedding ceremonies. A daughter married here. A cousin married there. A carefully arranged union could bring entire kingdoms under their control. It was a strategy so successful that it reshaped Europe. But strategies, like castles, sometimes contain hidden weaknesses. Every time the dynasty chose a spouse from within the same family circle, the pool of genetic diversity grew smaller. At first, the effects were subtle. Familiar faces, shared features, the distinctive Habsburg jaw appearing in portrait after portrait. Then the signs became harder to ignore. Health problems appeared more often. Some royal children struggled to develop normally. Fertility issues grew more common among later generations of the Spanish Habsburg line. Still, the system continued. Because politically, it worked. The crowns stayed in the family. The alliances remained stable. The dynasty preserved its enormous power for centuries. But biology does not follow political logic. While kings and queens focused on maintaining their empire, the family tree quietly folded inward. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. The same ancestors appeared again and again across generations. And eventually, the dynasty found itself facing a problem no diplomatic treaty could solve. The final Spanish Habsburg king, Charles II, was unable to produce an heir. Without a successor, the line ended. Just like that, the centuries-old dynasty that had ruled Spain collapsed, not through invasion or rebellion, but through the slow consequences of its own strategy. In many ways, the ending is strangely quiet. There is no dramatic final battle, no collapsing fortress, no angry mob storming the palace gates. Instead, there is simply a sick king dying in his bed in 1700 and a family tree that has finally run out of branches. Yet the story leaves behind a powerful reminder. History is full of empires built on brilliant ideas. Some rely on military power, others on trade, diplomacy, or clever political alliances. The Habsburgs built their empire through marriage, and for a long time it worked better than anyone could have imagined. But every strategy has limits. In trying so hard to keep their bloodline pure, the Habsburgs created a dynasty so tightly woven that it eventually had nowhere left to grow. Their family tree didn't spread outward into new branches, it curled inward. Until, one day, the last leaf quietly fell. By the early 1700s, European observers were starting to connect the dots. Diplomats, physicians, and historians quietly noticed that the Habsburgs seemed unusually prone to illness, infertility, and distinctive physical traits. At the time, nobody had the language of genetics to explain it, but people could still see the pattern. The royal portraits looked similar generation after generation, and the stories of fragile princes and sickly kings had become almost routine. Something about the dynasty's marriage strategy clearly wasn't working the way they hoped. Now imagine yourself sitting in a quiet study somewhere in Europe around the early 1700s. The candles burn low. Papers are spread across the desk, letters from ambassadors, notes from physicians, copies of royal genealogies that stretch back generations. You're not the only one studying them. Across Europe, curious minds have begun doing the same thing. Diplomats compare stories from different courts. Physicians quietly discuss unusual cases they've witnessed while treating royal patients. Historians reviewing dynastic records begin noticing patterns that seem difficult to ignore. Because when you line up the evidence side by side, the similarities become striking. Portraits from the Habsburg courts look remarkably alike. The same facial structure repeats. The same jawline appears again and again, sometimes subtle, sometimes dramatically pronounced. At first, people might dismiss this as simple family resemblance. After all, families often share physical traits. But the Habsburg resemblance goes further than that. Descriptions of royal children across several generations tell similar stories. Princes who grow slowly, young heirs who struggle with illness, kings who have difficulty producing children of their own. Individually, each case might seem like unfortunate luck. Together they begin to look like a pattern, and humans are very good at noticing patterns. Picture two diplomats talking quietly after dinner in a palace somewhere in Vienna or Paris. One mentions the fragile health of Charles II. Another recalls similar stories about earlier Spanish princes. Someone else remembers a portrait where the famous jaw seemed almost exaggerated. Soon the conversation drifts toward an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the dynasty's habit of marrying close relatives has consequences. Now, no one phrases it exactly like that. The language of genetics does not yet exist. Gregor Mendel, the monk who would later discover the basic rules of inheritance, has not even been born yet. But the suspicion is there. Something about these repeated marriages inside the same family circle seems unhealthy. Of course, saying this openly would still be dangerous. Royal families do not appreciate being analysed like medical case studies. Diplomats still choose their words carefully, and physicians remain cautious when describing the health of kings. But the observations continue spreading quietly. Letters travel between courts describing royal illnesses. Historians compiling genealogies begin noting how frequently Habsburg marriages occurred between cousins, uncles, and nieces, or other close relatives. And once someone notices the pattern, it becomes hard to ignore. Because the dynasty's history almost reads like a long experiment, generation after generation repeating the same marriage strategy. Generation after generation showing similar traits and similar problems. By the time Charles II dies in 1700, the pattern feels almost obvious in hindsight. The Spanish Habsburg line has ended without an heir. The last king was physically fragile. The dynasty's famous features had become more pronounced with every generation. No one can explain exactly why. But many people are beginning to suspect the cause, and so, slowly, the story of the Habsburgs transforms from a tale of imperial power into something else entirely, a cautionary story, a reminder that even the most powerful dynasties in the world cannot escape the quiet laws of nature. Kings may command armies, sign treaties, and rule vast empires. But the rules of inheritance, whatever they may be, still apply, even to royalty. If you walk through a museum today and study portraits of the Habsburg rulers, you might notice something oddly consistent. The lips are slightly parted. The lower jaw pushes forward. The chin seems determined to arrive in the room before the rest of the face. Artists try to soften the effect with lighting, angles, and regal poses, but the resemblance across generations is unmistakable. What makes it even more fascinating is that these portraits weren't meant to expose flaws. They were meant to glorify the rulers. Yet despite every artistic trick, the family resemblance remained impossible to hide. Now imagine yourself stepping into one of those quiet museum galleries. The lighting is soft. The room is calm, almost silent except for the faint shuffle of shoes across polished floors. Along the walls hang enormous portraits framed in gold, paintings that once decorated royal palaces across Europe. You begin walking slowly past them. At first, they appear like any other royal gallery. Kings in armour, queens in embroidered gowns, velvet cloaks, jewelled crowns, and expressions carefully arranged to suggest power, wisdom, and perhaps just a hint of divine approval. But the longer you look, the more something begins to repeat. The faces start to look familiar. Not identical, of course. Each ruler lived in a different time. Hairstyles change with fashion. One king wears a dramatic lace collar that looks like a decorative dinner plate. Another sports a carefully groomed beard. Later portraits feature towering wigs that seem to add several inches of authority. But beneath the fashion changes, the same structure appears again and again. The jaw, it pushes forward slightly in one portrait. In another, it's even more pronounced. In some paintings, the lips remain parted, as though the subject paused mid-sentence and the artist captured the moment forever. Once you notice it, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. You begin moving from one painting to the next. There's Charles V with the familiar Habsburg profile, then Philip II, whose jaw seems to follow the same family blueprint. Later, another Habsburg archduke appears with a nearly identical structure of the face. And finally, near the end of the gallery, you arrive at Charles II of Spain. Here the famous feature reaches its most dramatic form. The lower jaw extends forward noticeably. The lips part naturally because closing them comfortably is difficult. Even with careful lighting and elaborate royal clothing, the structure of the face dominates the portrait. And remember, these paintings were never intended to reveal imperfections. Quite the opposite. Royal portraits were essentially political advertisements. Their purpose was to present the ruler as strong, noble, and unquestionably worthy of the throne. Artists were highly skilled professionals who knew exactly how to flatter their subjects. They softened shadows, they adjusted posture, they used clothing and accessories to guide the viewer's attention towards symbols of power rather than physical details. Yet even with all of these techniques, the family resemblance refused to disappear, because the artists could adjust lighting but they could not redesign the king's skeleton. What makes these portraits so fascinating today is that they unintentionally documented centuries of dynastic history. Each painting captured the physical features of the ruler with enough accuracy that modern historians and scientists can study them centuries later. In a way, the Habsburg Portrait Gallery became a visual record of the dynasty's genetic story. A story the artists themselves probably never realized they were helping to tell. Visitors standing in these galleries today often notice the same thing those early observers did. Generation after generation of rulers with remarkably similar faces. And as you leave the gallery, one thought lingers quietly in the back of your mind. The Habsburg dynasty spent centuries trying to preserve its bloodline, and the portraits prove that they succeeded, perhaps a little too well. Centuries later, scientists began examining the Habsburg lineage using modern genetic analysis. When researchers mapped the family tree, they discovered something astonishing. The degree of inbreeding in the later Habsburg generations was equivalent to what you would expect from children of siblings. That doesn't mean siblings were marrying each other directly, but repeated cousin and uncle-niece marriages across generations had slowly stacked the genetic deck in the same direction. What had once been a political strategy now revealed itself as a biological trap. Now imagine stepping forward in time a few hundred years. The candlelit palace archives are gone. The royal doctors with their leeches and theories about humours have been replaced by laboratories, research papers, and scientists who spend their days studying the quiet mathematics of heredity. Instead of ink-stained genealogists drawing family charts on parchment, modern researchers open enormous digital databases of historical records, birth records, marriage contracts, portrait collections, royal correspondence. When all of this information is placed together, the Habsburg family tree can finally be mapped in astonishing detail, and when scientists begin tracing the lines, something remarkable appears. The branches keep folding back into themselves, again and again. At first it looks confusing, like a maze where every path leads back to the same few names. But with modern tools, researchers can calculate exactly how often those loops occurred, and the numbers are surprising even to experts. Every time two relatives have children, the probability increases that certain inherited traits, especially rare or harmful ones, can appear. Normally, in large populations, genetic diversity spreads those traits out, so that they rarely cause problems. But the Habsburg dynasty did something unusual. Instead of widening their family tree with new branches, they kept folding it inward. Imagine shuffling a deck of cards. If you keep adding new cards, the deck becomes unpredictable and diverse. But if you keep reshuffling the same small stack again and again, the same combinations begin appearing repeatedly. That is essentially what happened to the Habsburg genetic deck. Over generations, cousin marriages, uncle-niece unions, and other close family alliances slowly concentrated the same inherited traits. Each generation stacked the odds a little further, until eventually the dynasty reached the era of Charles II. When modern geneticists examined his ancestry, they discovered something astonishing. The level of genetic relatedness in his family tree was extremely high, comparable to what might appear in the child of siblings. Again, this doesn't mean siblings themselves were marrying in the dynasty. Instead, it was the cumulative effect of repeated close marriages across centuries. It was like folding a piece of paper over and over until the layers became thick and rigid. By the time Charles II was born, the dynasty had unknowingly created a biological bottleneck. and the symptoms historians had long noticed: fragile health, infertility, and distinctive physical traits suddenly made scientific sense. The famous Habsburg jaw likely became more pronounced through inherited skeletal traits repeating across generations. Developmental problems and health issues may have emerged because certain recessive genetic conditions were more likely to appear in such a closely related lineage. In other words, the strategy that once seemed politically brilliant had quietly created a biological trap. The Habsburgs believed they were protecting their empire by keeping power inside the family, but in doing so they also kept recycling the same genetic material. And biology, unlike politics, has rules that cannot be negotiated. Today, the Habsburg dynasty is studied not just by historians, but by geneticists, anthropologists, and medical researchers. Their story has become one of the most famous historical examples of how dynastic marriage patterns can influence health across generations. It is a reminder that even the most powerful families in the world cannot escape the quiet laws written inside every human cell. Kings may control armies, empires may stretch across continents. But inheritance, true biological inheritance, follows rules far older than any throne, and in the case of the Habsburgs, those rules were patiently waiting for centuries before science finally explained what history had been trying to show all along. The Habsburg story highlights a strange truth about power. Kings and emperors could command armies, redraw maps, and control vast empires, but they could not command biology. For centuries, the dynasty believed that keeping their bloodline tightly controlled would preserve their power. In reality, nature doesn't care about crowns, thrones, or imperial titles. The same genetic rules apply to emperors and peasants alike. And slowly, generation by generation, those rules caught up with them. Now, imagine standing in the throne room of a great European palace. The room is designed to make one idea perfectly clear. The person sitting on that throne holds enormous power. Marble columns rise toward painted ceilings. Giant tapestries display victories in battle. Gold decorations catch the light of hundreds of candles. At the far end of the hall sits the king. When he speaks, armies move, laws change. Entire provinces can be gained or lost through the stroke of a pen. In the Age of Empires, rulers like the Habsburgs controlled enormous forces. They negotiated treaties that shaped the borders of Europe. They commanded soldiers across continents. Their decisions influenced trade routes, religions, and the fate of millions of people. In short, they seemed almost unstoppable, and that sense of control shaped the way the dynasty thought about everything, including marriage. From their perspective, controlling the bloodline was simply another political strategy. Just as they could arrange alliances between kingdoms, they could arrange alliances within their own family, a cousin here, a niece there, another carefully chosen relative who already belonged to the royal network. Each marriage seemed to strengthen the dynasty. Each wedding preserved the empire's carefully balanced web of alliances. To the kings and queens arranging these unions, it felt like brilliant diplomacy. What they didn't realize was that they were negotiating with a force far older than politics. Biology, unlike rival kingdoms or ambitious nobles, biology cannot be persuaded with treaties. It does not attend diplomatic meetings. It does not respond to royal authority. It simply follows its own quiet rules. Imagine two farmers in a small village during the same era. They know nothing about genetics either, but they understand something through experience. When families in small communities marry too closely over many generations, certain traits begin to appear more often. Animals bred within small herds sometimes grow weaker. Plants grown from the same narrow stock struggle to thrive. Farmers notice these things long before scientists can explain them. But inside royal palaces, that kind of practical observation rarely reaches the throne room. Instead, the Habsburg dynasty focuses on political logic. If marrying within the family keeps the empire stable, then it must be the correct choice. And for a long time, that logic seems to work. Their empire expands, their relatives occupy thrones across Europe, their dynasty remains one of the most powerful ruling houses on the continent for centuries. But slowly, something else is happening behind the scenes. Each generation narrows the genetic pool. Each cousin marriage folds the family tree inward just a little more. At first, the consequences are subtle. Familiar faces, shared features, small health problems that might be dismissed as bad luck. Then the signs grow stronger. Fragile heirs, difficulty producing children, distinctive physical traits that appear again and again. By the time Charles II is born, the dynasty has unknowingly reached the limits of its strategy. All the political brilliance in the world cannot rewrite the basic rules of human inheritance. The kings who once commanded armies and ruled continents find themselves facing a problem they cannot solve with power. Because the laws of biology apply equally to everyone. Emperors, farmers, peasants, princes. The same invisible mechanisms govern every human body, regardless of how. Many crowns appear in the family treasury, and over the course of centuries those rules quietly caught up with one of the most powerful dynasties Europe had ever known. Not with a battle, not with a rebellion, but with something far simpler. A family tree that slowly folded in on itself until even an empire could not escape it. Looking back now, the Habsburg dynasty almost feels like a grand historical experiment, one carried out unknowingly over hundreds of years. Their ambition shaped Europe, their marriages redrew political alliances, and their empire once stretched across continents. Yet in trying so hard to keep their family line pure, they accidentally created the very weaknesses that would end it. It's a reminder that history isn't just shaped by wars and treaties. Sometimes it's shaped by wedding invitations. Now imagine stepping back and viewing the entire Habsburg story from a distance. Not from inside a palace or a throne room, but from centuries later, where historians quietly piece together the strange puzzle of this dynasty. On the surface, the Habsburgs appear as one of the most successful ruling families Europe ever produced. Their strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of conquering every neighbouring kingdom with endless wars, they built alliances through marriage. A princess married a prince, a cousin inherited a throne. A carefully arranged wedding could bring entire territories into the family network, and it worked. For generations, the Habsburgs expanded their influence across Europe. Spain, Austria, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and vast lands overseas all fell under their control at different moments in history. Their family became so widespread that one famous saying summed up their strategy perfectly: "Let others wage war, you, fortunate Austria, marry." But like many clever plans, it contained a hidden flaw. Because each of those marriages that strengthened the empire politically also tightened the family circle, biologically. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. The dynasty kept turning inward to preserve power. At first, it looked like success. The empire grew stronger. The family tree remained firmly connected to the same royal bloodlines. The Habsburg name became almost synonymous with European power. But biology, as we now understand, works differently than diplomacy. When families repeatedly marry within the same small circle of relatives, the diversity of inherited traits shrinks. Harmless characteristics may repeat, but so can harmful ones. Over time, the dynasty began to show the signs. The famous Habsburg jaw became more pronounced. Certain health problems appeared more often. Some heirs struggled to survive childhood. Others faced difficulties producing heirs of their own. Yet the system continued, because no one at the time understood why these things were happening. From the perspective of kings and queens arranging marriages in the 1500s and 1600s, the strategy still seemed perfectly logical. Keeping power inside the family was the safest political choice available. The irony, of course, is that the very policy designed to preserve the dynasty eventually helped bring about its end. By the time Charles II of Spain was born, the genetic deck had been stacked through generations of intermarriage. The fragile king who struggled through illness for his entire life represented the final chapter of a centuries-long pattern. When he died without an heir in 1700, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty ended, not with a dramatic fall of castles or a final battlefield defeat, but with something quieter, a family line that simply could not continue. Looking back, the Habsburg story feels almost like a slow-motion experiment that history conducted without realizing it. A powerful dynasty following a strategy that made perfect sense politically while unknowingly setting biological limits that would eventually catch up with them. And that may be the most fascinating lesson hidden inside their story. History is often told through wars, revolutions, and the decisions of powerful rulers. But sometimes the forces shaping the future are much smaller. A marriage contract signed in a quiet chapel, a royal wedding celebrated with music and wine, a family tree that slowly folds inward over centuries. And somewhere inside all those wedding invitations and carefully arranged alliances, the fate of one of Europe's greatest dynasties was quietly being decided. And now, the palace finally grows quiet. The candles in the great halls have burned low, their flames shrinking into soft golden dots against the stone walls. The courtiers have drifted away to their chambers, the scribes have put down their quills, and somewhere deep in the palace kitchens, the last pots of the evening stew are cooling beside the hearth. It has been a long journey through the strange, glittering world of the Habsburg dynasty. You've walked through candlelit corridors where kings ruled empires that stretched across continents. You've watched royal weddings arranged like pieces on a chessboard, each marriage meant to secure power, alliances, and territory. And you've seen how generation after generation believed they were preserving something sacred, a dynasty meant to last forever. But history, as it often does, had other plans. For all their crowns, armies and palaces, the Habsburgs were still human. They worried about heirs, about rivals, about keeping their family name alive in a world where power could disappear overnight. Their solution was simple, at least in their minds. Keep the bloodline close. Keep the throne within the family. Keep everything under control. And for a while it worked. Their empire grew. Their influence stretched across Europe. Their name became one of the most powerful in history. But slowly, quietly, the consequences began to appear. In portraits, in illnesses, in fragile kings and uncertain heirs. Until one day the great Spanish branch of the dynasty simply ended. Not with a dramatic battle or a crumbling castle wall, just a sickly king, a quiet death, and an empire suddenly without a future. Yet even in this strange and slightly uncomfortable chapter of history, there's something deeply human. Because behind the crowns and titles were people doing what humans have always done, trying to protect their families, trying to hold on to power, trying to shape the future the best way they knew how. Sometimes wisely, sometimes not so wisely. So tonight, as you settle into your warm bed with soft blankets, modern medicine, and a family tree that hopefully doesn't resemble a complicated loop diagram, you might take a quiet moment to appreciate just how far the world has come. Because history may be messy, strange, and occasionally filled with royal chins of legendary proportions. But it's also the story of how we learned slowly and imperfectly from the past. And now the palace lights fade, the halls grow silent, the dynasty becomes another whisper in the long winding story of history. So get comfortable, close your eyes, and drift off knowing that tonight at least, your family tree is probably a lot less complicated than a Habsburg's. Good night.